At our very last session for today. We have an excellent discussion so far, and excellent speakers, and I'm now glad that in our very last panel we'll have Her Excellency Rose Gottemoeller, Deputy Secretary General of NATO. Rose Gottemoeller served before as Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security at the U.S. Department of State. She's an experienced diplomat and analyst. And Your Excellency, as the President of Sofia Security Forum, it's my great pleasure to welcome you at this conference, which is co-organized with Konrad Adenauer Foundation, with Wilfred Marsen Center for European Studies, and the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy. So welcome, warmly welcome to our conference. I would like to start our conversation by asking you a more general question about this current security worldwide. We face different risks and threats, radicalization, terrorism, emergence of terrorist organizations like Daesh. We have tensions with Syria, in Syria right now. We have tensions with Russia. And some researchers said that we are facing a new Cold War. So my question would be, what is your assessment of the current situation? What is your assessment of current security environment? Are we on the verge of war? Is this a Cold War, or what is your analysis?
I'll give my answer no to both of those questions, and I'll tell you why. But first, I do want to apologize for this delay in our last session today. It's a testimony to my very intensive and extensive discussions with my Bulgarian government counterparts and also with the Vice President, and it's been a very good day of deep discussion. But I have kept you waiting, so I do apologize for that. I can assure you that there was talk of issues of great concern to this audience, including Bulgaria's role in NATO and the European Union, including the presidency of the Council at the moment, with some very important priorities, of course, being tackled in this ministerial meeting coming up today and tomorrow, and then through to the Council meeting. But Western Balkans are front and center in all of the discussions that are going on. So it's been a good day, a very useful day from my perspective, but again, I'm sorry to keep you waiting. Now, why do I say no to those two questions? First of all, it is clear that we are in a difficult security situation at the present time, a very difficult security situation. It is not new. The watershed year in NATO we always consider to be 2014. The year that the Russian Federation seized Crimea, changing borders by force in Europe for the first time since World War II. It was a watershed from that perspective, and we've seen Russia continue its aggressive behavior, including in the Donbass, in eastern Ukraine, and pressing up against the borders of NATO. So we're concerned from that perspective, but 2014 also saw the rise of ISIS, the rise of Daesh, their seizure of Mosul, their seizure of territory, and their attempt to really establish a caliphate. That was a real, I think, wake-up call about the threats of violent extremism also, and that it was something we really, as NATO, had to pay attention to. We have been able, by very hard work in the global coalition, to push back Daesh. We are still, I think, going to face threats of violent extremism. I don't want to in any way sugarcoat what challenges we still have to face in this regard, but we have been able to counter their territorial gains in the last years. As far as Russia is concerned, we still have many challenges there, but I do want to underscore that NATO is pursuing a two-track policy: strong deterrence and defense. Bulgaria is very much a part of that here in this region, close to the Black Sea, with our tailored forward presence measures. At the same time, we are working in every way we can to pursue dialogue with Russia, because when the going gets tough, that's when you need open lines of communication to try to avoid incidents and accidents spiraling out of control and really causing the potential for crisis and heaven forbid, even conflict. But no, we're not on the brink of war. In fact, we're doing everything we can to push back from the potential for conflict, from the potential for crisis. That's the first point I want to make. And I always like to say that now is much different from the Cold War. The key reason, from my perspective, is that we have so many lines of communication open now. When I think about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and many of you will have read the history of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was 10 years old at that point, but I do remember, even as a child, that, you know, well, we were really wondering how best to get in touch with the Kremlin. How would we communicate with Premier Khrushchev and the Politburo? And, you know, there were speculations about how to open up a back channel and so forth. But nowadays, we have a lot of lines of communication open, and it's very, I think, good that we still have the ability to be in touch and to try to maintain dialogue. We had a very good meeting just a couple of weeks ago between General Scaparrotti, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, and General Gerasimov, the Russian Chad. Those lines of communication are very, very important, and they are different from the Cold War.
Today, as you see, the title of our conference is Towards a New EU Defense Identity. Tomorrow, Ministers of Defense of European Union will discuss the way ahead.
What I'll be there.
Okay. But I would like to ask you a question from your perspective. How do you consider the development of European defense identity? Do you think it's a kind of emancipation from NATO, or in general, how NATO and EU relations will be developing in the future? Today we had several ministers of defense speaking about relations between EU and NATO, and I think that the key word was complementarity. Mm-hmm. But what is your view? What is NATO's view? How does relations will be developing in the future?
I'm going to start by quoting my boss, Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General. He always emphasizes that, you know, NATO has this great, I would say, challenge before us in terms of defense burden sharing. And people like to talk about President Trump and the way he's been pressuring NATO and putting demands on NATO. Well, I want to back us up to that watershed year of 2014, and that was a wake-up call for the alliance. And all of the allies agreed in that year that we needed to turn the corner. We had been, in many NATO countries, cutting defense budgets, and for good reason. In the midst of the financial crisis, 2008 to 2012 or so, countries, governments needed those funds for social welfare, for economic development, for education, for medical care. So defense went begging. But 2014, as that wake-up call across the alliance, there was consensus that it was time to stop the cuts. So 2014, at the Wales Summit, the Defense Investment Pledge was put in place, that the NATO countries would work toward 2% of GDP, and they would also work toward putting 20% of those defense funds into acquiring new capabilities, defense investment, in other words. So it started a long time ago to push in the direction of building up defense expenditures in a judicious way. And for that reason, Jens Stoltenberg likes to say that everything the EU does in terms of putting together a new defense identity can help us with the burden sharing issue and can help us to raise defense expenditures, defense investment. But again, it's very important. I like that complementarity word. We use it also. But there are really three factors that we focus on. First of all, it's related to complementarity, but we say we need to have coherence so that when NATO sets requirements and priorities for defense expenditure, the EU and we are talking, and there's transparency between the two of us, and EU priorities and requirements have at least a similarity with what NATO is asking, so that there's no competition between the two. It's unfair for Sofia, for Bulgaria, if NATO's asking for X, Y, and Z, and EU is asking for A, B, and C. We need to have some coherence in the kinds of demands we're placing on member states who are members of both NATO and the EU. The second point we like to emphasize is that forces that are developed as part of the new EU defense identity, they should be available for NATO operations as well. And so there should be that kind of good cooperation that we can, in NATO, call upon these new EU defense units if necessity arises. And then the third issue is one that is strongly felt among the non-EU NATO allies. And they're a very different group. They extend from Norway in the north to Turkey in the south to the United States of America and Canada in North America, and soon to be the UK, as well as countries here in the Western Balkans, Albania, Montenegro, Croatia, that are not yet members of the European Union. So it's a very diverse bunch of countries, but the main point we've been stressing in our conversations with the EU is that there needs to be some transparency for the EU, non-EU NATO countries, so that they can really understand what's going on and also be part of the conversation.
Thank you very much for touching on the issue of capabilities and the 2% pledge. Unfortunately, even my country, Bulgaria, does not fulfill this aim. But don't you think that we have to implement a bottom-up approach to convince societies, people, that we have to invest more in security and defense? Actually, according to some public opinion polls, Europeans, they would like to see more common actions to provide security within Europe for Europeans. Should we invest more in working with the society, with the people, with NGOs?
I really think that is very important indeed, and at NATO we have a lot of efforts going on. We've got this great, you can check out our website, We Are NATO campaign, where we're trying to really reach out and make NATO more comprehensible to publics around the alliance, but also beyond, to our partner countries, to countries who, like Russia, may not think much of NATO, may actually not like NATO at all at the moment in any event. So we are trying to tell the NATO story better, and we invite your cooperation and partnership in that regard. But also, I like to think of it too as being a matter of greater recognition for the men and women who serve in our armed forces. I know that Sunday is St. George's Day here. It's the Day of Armed Forces for the Bulgarian military, and it should be a day when the men and women who are serving on the ground, day in, day out, young people, many of them, when they get credit where credit is due. And we have a good deal of admiration at NATO headquarters in Brussels for the Bulgarian Armed Forces, the work you've been doing in Afghanistan and the Resolute Support Mission, Kosovo, the long-standing service with KFOR, also the work that you're doing in Ukraine as the leader on the Medical Rehabilitation Trust Fund. So Bulgaria is contributing a lot, and who's making that contribution? It's the Bulgarian Armed Forces who are making that contribution. So I also think it's a matter of giving credit where credit is due and getting that story out that, yes, we are all NATO, we're all working together, but at the heart of it, it's the national armed forces that really make NATO tick.
Yeah, I think that it's an excellent program. We are NATO. We have to convince our societies that NATO is playing a very positive role as provider of security for Europe, but beyond. In the recent years, we see new old threats like hybrid warfare, cyber attacks, online disinformation. What NATO is doing to counter this threat? And my second question will be, whose responsibility would be to counter this threat, whether it's common bodies like EU, NATO, or individual states, or non-state actors like NGOs or other parts of civil society?
Well, let me start on that latter point, because I do think that this is an area where NATO-EU cooperation makes a good deal of sense. And we've already started to develop some NATO and EU cooperation that I can use to illustrate in general what NATO is doing. The first thing you need to do in fighting these hybrid, or as we call them, asymmetric threats, is to have the best possible information and intelligence. And so the hybrid analysis cell at the EU is working together with our hybrid intelligence unit at NATO to develop closer and closer cooperation in the exchange of information, in analyzing, in developing better understanding of exactly what we are facing. So that's a first order of business. I think it's the most important first step you can take, is to understand exactly what the challenge is, and that requires good information and good analysis. So there we are working with the EU. The second step is to really focus on resilience in our societies. And that means making sure that we are able to comprehend and recognize when these kinds of incidents are occurring, and that we can quickly fight back. The cyber realm is one that's been getting a lot of work out lately with the various viruses. The WannaCry case was a very, very recent one. But at NATO, we have a group response unit that works on getting information out very quickly, again, on what kind of response will be effective, and helping armed forces and helping countries to have advice about how to make the patches and repairs that they need to make to ensure that their systems are resilient to these kinds of attacks. So resilience is something that, again, we're working on with the EU, thinking through these kinds of issues. And it's those two things. First of all, better information, sharing of information and analysis, and working hard and intensively on building up resilience to these kinds of attacks. Those, to my mind, are the two most important issues. Now, for NATO, going into our summit in July, we are going to be focusing increasingly on questions of deterrence policy and how best to deter. I think, frankly, two of the basics in deterring these kinds of attacks are understanding, information and analysis leading to understanding, and then having resilient systems so that attacks don't have the effect that they are intended to have. So, but then how do you put it all together to develop a strong deterrence strategy? These are some of the questions that will be, I think, front and center for NATO, and we hope in discourse with the EU to drive forward to have some very good cooperation in that area as well, to think about how to bolster our deterrence in the face of such threats.
Yeah. Before I turn to the audience and give the possibility for more questions, I have the probably last one from my side, having in mind that in our audience is is a Vice Prime Minister and Minister of Defense of the Republic of Macedonia. I would like to ask you about your view, or NATO's view, on the future of this region. You know that Bulgaria put as its priority of the EU presidency the European way of the Western Balkans. So what is your view, how this region will be developing in the future, how we can support these countries to get closer, and not only closer, but the members of NATO?
Well, we are doing everything we can to support the countries who have indicated that they aspire to join NATO. And we are very, very pleased to be working with Skopje, with the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, to develop their reform efforts. And we have an office in Skopje to help in that effort. And I'm honored to see the Vice Prime Minister here. Thank you very much for coming this afternoon. It is worthwhile repeating once again our two basic principles. That is that NATO has an open door. That is part of our basic treaty, the Washington Treaty, and it means that any European country that can has an aspiration to join NATO and can fulfill the requirements to do so, the door is open. And the second principle is one that flows out of the Helsinki process and has been in place for many, many years, but is an inherent part of how NATO tackles these issues. And that is, NATO goes by the basic principle that no country has the right to veto another's security choices. Every country must decide for itself what best suits its national security interests. So we are very, very firm about that. This is going to be a big topic for our summit meeting, July 11th and 12th. There's still work to be done, as I know there is on the EU side, and there will be a meeting coming up here in Bulgaria in a couple weeks' time to discuss just these issues related to the EU's open door. So I think steady as she goes. Let's keep working the issues, the problems, and see where we end up in the middle of July.
Good. By the way, the summit will take place in new headquarters?
Oh, we just moved into our new headquarters this week. It is wonderful. I have to tell you, some of you may have seen some of my media interactions, but it got to be funny. If you've been in our old headquarters, you know it's a dear old headquarters. We've been in there for 51 years now. It was built as a hospital. It is frankly falling down around our ears. I had a huge leak in the ceiling of my office, and it was time to move. So we moved this week into our, we're moving kind of office by office. So SecGen and I moved this past week with the private office. It's wonderful to be in the new headquarters. And I hope you'll all come and visit us soon there.
Okay, great. So now I open the floor for discussions. Please, Alessandro Marone, Italian Institute for International Affairs, Head of Defense Program. Please.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Madam. Thank you for the introduction. I mean, 2016 in Warsaw, the joint declaration NATO-EU was a very significant step forward because it gave a political mandate to the respective bureaucracies and staff military to work together on a daily basis, yes, or ideally. And we had the implementation proposal end of 2016 and end of 2017. What is your assessment of this rapprochement between EU and NATO? Which are the obstacles and what can be done to overcome the obstacles to have more concrete cooperation? Thank you.
I will say on the NATO-EU cooperation that it is a work in progress, there's no question about it, but I say that in the most positive possible way, because I have seen, even in the time I've been at NATO, I was not at the Warsaw Summit, I hadn't yet taken up this job, I only came in October of 2016. But the EU-NATO cooperation has grown by leaps and bounds in the time that I have been in this position. In December of 2016, we launched 34 projects of various kinds, and afterwards, just this last December, we added another 23 projects. We're all saying to each other, we have plenty of projects on the table now. We need to focus on implementation. I think that is the important message now. But I do see on a day-in, day-out basis that the staffs are working together very intensively and very, I would say, very pragmatically to try to put in place some positive cooperation. There are still unanswered questions. For example, some of them are related to the new EU defense identity. What is PESCO? How exactly is it going to be structured? How is the European Defense Fund going to be structured? How, will NATO, that's why I was talking about the necessity of transparency for the non-EU NATO allies. How will they be able to dock in? How will they be able to participate in discussions about PESCO and the EDF? By way of example. So there's still some unfinished work on the EU side that we're very interested in how it will unfold. But I will say there's a good deal of will and interest on the two sides. We've already seen some projects take shape. I mentioned the hybrid intelligence units, EU and NATO working very closely together. Frankly, for the upcoming summit, we'd like to place the emphasis in a couple of areas. The fight against terrorism is one area. clearly also issues such as women, peace, and security, and how to ensure that the treatment of civilians in armed conflict, these are issues that NATO and the EU are pulling together on, pulling in the same direction. We have similar interests. So those are a few additional examples beyond what I was talking about. But don't take this as the end of the tale. We will have, I think, a very good story to tell on NATO-EU cooperation in time for the summit. For your information, the Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, together with Presidents Juncker and Tusk, plan to sign another joint statement at the summit meeting, which you will probably recollect the Warsaw Summit statement that they made. So this will be a next step that will take account of progress that has occurred since 2016.
Next question. Shall we take two questions? I see two colleagues of mine. Zlatogor Minchev. And after that, Sobi Sobev.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Madam Secretary. My name is Zlatogor Minchev. I'm running research center at the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences. My question perspective is coming from the technological part, as I'm an IT guy. So how do you see the concept of deterrence and resilience from technological part? Because nowadays machines are getting more and more intelligent.
Yes. So
this is a big discussion on this within the NATO community and both in Europe. So I would appreciate if you share something from your perspective. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Madam Deputy Secretary General, thank you very much for some good news you brought to this audience concerning the upcoming NATO summit in July. You mentioned that NATO is considering to strengthen its deterrence strategy. But it's not only about the strategy. What is your personal understanding? It seems to me it's time to relocate NATO to relocate some of its infrastructure, including forces to the east. When we have a stronger deterrence presence in the eastern part of the alliance, I think that Russia will be more willing for dialogue and probably to some compromises. What's your personal view? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Two excellent questions. First, let me take the issue of deterrence in cyberspace and in the realm of, as I take it, you are also referring to the emergence of artificial intelligence and developments in that vein. These developments are taking deterrence theory and the study of deterrence to a new level. So I don't have a complete answer for you, but it is an issue that NATO is thinking deeply about, just as we are going to be tackling issues related to hybrid or asymmetric threats, and these two things are related. How to deter at the level below a kinetic conflict, so-called Article 5. These are core questions that NATO is grappling with now, because the whole array of hybrid or asymmetric threats that are facing NATO countries today, real time, right now, have expanded in recent years. So thinking through how to deter below the level of Article 5, as we put it, is an all-consuming, very important one, and something NATO will be working on going forward. We do have some good examples, I think, of how deterrence can work in some of the more or less traditional ways. One involves solid forensics and then attribution. And I'm thinking of the case a couple of years ago when the United States conveyed to China in no uncertain terms their concern about some cyber attacks that had occurred. So it was very thorough forensics, followed then by a public attribution, but also some very private and firm diplomatic messaging saying, don't do this again, we're watching. So I think it's, in a way, there are some of the approaches of typical deterrence that can work, but I think we have a lot more work to do to think through the various challenges, how they are emerging, and then how are we going to address them in the realm of deterrence going forward. So it's an excellent question. I don't have a complete answer. I can assure you that we are thinking about it a lot. So if your institute is also thinking about it a lot, we would welcome a conversation and like to hear what you are thinking. On the question of what we are going to do further for bringing forward troops in Eastern Europe, I want to stress we see since the Warsaw Summit really a huge amount of progress. It's not only the so-called enhanced forward presence in the 3 Baltic states and Poland. I have to be honest with you, when I came to work at NATO in October of 2016, it was already 5 months after the NATO summit in Warsaw, and I thought, there is no way we will get these 4 battle groups deployed and certified by July of 2017. That was the goal. It was agreed at Warsaw we'd get these 4 battle groups in place. We would have multiple NATO countries in each of the 3 Baltic states and in Poland providing a deterrence presence and training together, exercising together, able to operate together. It's been very impressive what we've been able to do, and each of those 4 battle groups was certified, and they are going through additional rounds of certification procedures to ensure they continue to be up to the task that has been set them. Now the question is, and it is for our next summit, indeed you put your finger on it, what are we going to do now to be able to reinforce? And I want to stress that this is not reinforcement as we thought about it. Again, I'm old enough to remember the Cold War. I'm old enough to remember Reforger. But those kinds of major exercises where the United States was pumping a division into Europe to exercise, they were based on permanent infrastructure that was in place. Thousands of U.S. troops were deployed with their families in Europe. We do not believe we need that today. We do not want new conflict. We certainly, as I said a moment ago, do not want a Cold War, but we need to have a credible deterrent, and that means the ability to reinforce. That means having the command and control system that is fit for purpose. That will be another major goal of this summit meeting. So reinforcement, NATO command structure adaptation to make it fit for purpose to handle this reinforcement task, and then further planning for things like the critical infrastructure. Many of you will have heard time and time again, and it's very much in the EU context as well, the words military mobility. How are we going to be able to reinforce if we don't have the road structure, the bridges, the train cars, if we don't have what we need to be able to move troops and equipment across Europe if we need to? So these are the kinds of big topics that are being tackled now in preparation for the summit coming up in July. I think about the battle groups as being the initial deterrent and defense force. Now, this next summit, so Warsaw was all about that. This next summit is going to be what will back them up if the need arises. And I want to stress again, it's not a matter of putting permanent infrastructure in place in terms of large barracks, big military bases, et cetera, et cetera. It's the ability to reinforce if the need arises.
Thank you. We have a question from Mr. Anjo Angel, of Defense Advisor to the Prime Minister and former Minister of Defense, probably the last question.
Your Excellency, you are aware, I'm sure, that there are difficulties for the politics of open doors for some Western Balkans countries. I have in mind Bosnia Herzegovina. Do you think that the fulfillment of the precondition to get a start on a membership action plan for Bosnia Herzegovina could be fulfilled if you bear in mind that the Russian influence on Republika Srpska is quite a lot, and Republika Srpska is the main reason not to fulfill this precondition by the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So can you say that the open door of NATO for Bosnia and Herzegovina is closed already?
No. It's not. It's not up to me to give you a prediction right now about what will be happening. I mentioned in my remarks that there's still issues that are being worked through in the NATO context, working with the countries involved. I will say this, that first of all, both NATO and the EU are famous for conditionality because we found over the years that it's necessary in order to drive the necessary pace of reforms. So I do not believe in any way, shape, or form that NATO will abandon conditionality on Bosnia and Herzegovina. But there may be ways to look at handling it in a slightly different way, and so we will see what happens in that regard. Again, it's not up to me to predict what the NATO countries will decide, but we do think it's very important to continue the conditions in place so that there is leverage, there's a push continuing toward reforms, and that reforms get accomplished and that we see results. That said, I would also note that we've had very good conversations with all of our aspiring countries in the run-up to the Foreign Ministerial, Defense Ministerial in June, and then the summit in July. I expect those conversations will continue. So it's a very, very intensive conversation at this point, and we'll see where we arrive.
Maybe one very last question.
Okay.
I see that we don't have too much time, but very last question from this young man over there. And after that, I'll turn to Thorsten Geisler to make some closing remarks. I don't know, it will not be a summary because it was very rich discussion today.
Okay, very good.
Thank you. Mark Sokolov from the Center for National Security and Defense Research at the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences. Thank you for your answers on every question asked so far. And I'm well aware that I'm risking being provocative, but my question is going to go to Serbia as long as we're on the topic of the Balkans. Because so far it's the only country that's not declared any aspirations to join NATO, yet every other country around it has. It also is part of the Partnership for Peace. It also has taken part in some exercises. Also, we have the fact that in recent years it became kind of like a law for a country to join NATO before joining the EU. So do you see in the medium to near future Serbia being in a way forced to make a definitive decision on NATO about joining it? Thank you.
You know, we have lots of partners who never want to join NATO and never will want to join NATO. I'm thinking of Austria, Sweden, Finland, Australia. We wouldn't want them to join NATO because they're way across the world. But we have very close partners who work with us very intensively. Some of them train and exercise with us. Well, all of them participate in training and exercise activities in one way or another, some more than others. But some of them are also more intensively involved in information exchanges and even intelligence exchanges. So it's really, I think, again, up to countries to decide what kind of speed, you know, we're kind of, it's that old, I'm not going to say that old word, multiple speed, but it's up to them to decide how intensively they want to engage with NATO. I have to say, and I've been twice to Belgrade in the last year, very good lines of communication open. Jens Stoltenberg, again, the Secretary General, spent part of his growing up years in Belgrade, so he has very good lines of communication open with leaders there. I think those lines of communication are important. We need to understand what the dynamics are. For example, because NATO has been in Kosovo for so long in the KFOR mission, we have an interest in understanding what the dynamics are of the Belgrade-Pristina dialogue. It's one that's overseen by the EU, so NATO is not at the table per se, but we need to stay in close touch, and we certainly encourage progress in that venue. So I don't see any contradiction for any partner country if they say, we never want to join NATO, we want to join the EU. That's absolutely fine. It's absolutely up to the country involved.